All right, shall we get this show on the road? Good evening once again. Thank you for joining me for another webinar in our series on managing behaviour, in particular what to do about tantrums. So we've got a nice turnout tonight. We've got a real good group going here, I think. There's a lovely dynamic going on in the chat, and I'm feeling really good about joining you again on a Tuesday evening. Hey, we're up to session number 4, which is pretty impressive, I think. You guys have done 3 sessions already. If you haven't managed to participate live before, I think you'll pick it up pretty quick. But I hope you've had a chance to look at some of the recordings and the handouts that are available in the emails that we're sending around, because each week we're building on what we've already done, and it won't necessarily make a whole lot of sense if you're not up to speed with us. Anyway, so I'm Tony. If you've not come across the videos before, I'm a psychologist from the Parenting Research Centre, and I'm joining you from Melbourne. But tonight, through the magic of the internet, you might be all over Australia or indeed the world, and we've had some people introducing themselves in chat, and indeed we are kind of spread out, aren't we? It's nice. Okay, so before I go any further, just a few acknowledgements. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the support of the Victorian Government, who have very generously funded this project, which is why it comes to you at no cost. Of course, it is open to parents or interested people all around Australia, but it's funded particularly by the Victorian Government. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're meeting tonight and pay my respects to their elders past and present, as well as acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people we may have joining us tonight. You might have noticed last week was Reconciliation Week here in Australia, which was an interesting time. I don't know if you caught that on the news or had stuff going on around you. They had the Statement from the Heart, which is a very important document for the future of reconciliation in Australia. So definitely an interesting topic at the moment. The traditional owners where I am are the Wurundjeri people, by the way. That's in the sort of local Melbourne area, but of course you'll have different traditional owners wherever you are. I encourage you to find out a bit about them if you're able to. All right, so let's move on. Now we're talking about pretty tricky issues. As always, parenting can be a pretty personal thing and it can get to us. If you find that to be the case, you do need to seek further help. I strongly suggest that. All I can do for you is really give you general advice. If it's starting to cause big problems for you, check out some more individualized support. There are some some options to get you started on the screen, like Raising Children Network is probably how you came across this series. Has some good information on there. You can try out the hotlines, look up your GP, something like that. Now, a little bit about the course, because it is a course. Don't treat this as a one-off session where you're going to get some tasty tip that you can take away and cure your child's tantrums quick smart. You need to get the whole kind of background and the whole approach for it to actually work. The way we've organized things is we had one session at the start, didn't we, which was pretty rapid, pretty intense, the amount of information we crammed into that. Then we've had 3 sessions in this kind of second level here. And then the final part of the course is another 3 sessions where we're building on what we've already learned. We're kind of adding more skills, tweaking it a bit, and giving you more of a chance to interact and ask for more support, give your feedback, what you're struggling with, that kind of thing. So this is what we've done so far. Congratulations, some big ticks. Hopefully it's already starting to help. Don't be alarmed if it's not, though. We're a long way from getting through everything we need to still. But tonight you can see we're up to responding to your child's behaviour, which is a pretty exciting topic. I think you'll find this interesting. It's one that parents tend to be kind of hanging out for. So I hope I'm coming through loud and clear, by the way. I think the technology has generally been kind to us so far. I won't have myself on the screen the whole time. I'll turn myself off in a moment on purpose. It's not an error if I disappear in a sec, okay? So let's check out where we're up to. I'm going to turn off my video at the moment so this is a bit bigger for you. You know how we talked about this thing called the behaviour chain? This is another way of looking at that. What you've got is your child just behaving, doing stuff every day. Each time they do something, they get a response, and they do something and they get a response, and they do something else and they get a response. It won't always be from you, it'll be from their environment in general. Remember in session 2 we talked about the environment and how that influences behaviour? So this is just kind of like that behaviour chain is going on all the time, and we've done a lot of work on understanding how one behaviour leads to another based on the response it gets. In particular, we're interested in, maybe one of these is a tantrum, okay? We're going to focus our attention in on what goes on around that tantrum. In particular, we might be interested in what? You guys know this. The trigger. So what happens before the tantrum? And the consequence, the kind of response they get from the world as a result of the tantrum. Remember though, trigger, behavior, consequence, that's the kind of the real meaty core of this functional assessment approach, and that's how you get out the purpose, right? That's key. Now ideally, what we also want to think about, or well, what we want to identify while we're sort of doing our background thinking is a replacement behavior. This shouldn't be news to you guys if you've participated in previous sessions somehow. We want something better for them to do than the tantrum, ideally that meets the same purpose. And we want to, you see that green arrow? I'll do that again. That green arrow appears. That's us trying to get the replacement behavior happening. So some sort of prompt, some sort of new way of leading into that behavior. Then hopefully it happens and we can give a consequence, which would be a positive consequence, right? So we've kind of, you can see we've created this little side path here around the tantrum so that the tantrum doesn't need to happen anymore. That's the theory. And of course we've also talked about more powerful techniques in terms of moving back earlier in the behavior chain. Right, look at what happened before the trigger. Well, there are some signs that we were heading in a risky direction and we might have been able to do something before the tantrum even got triggered to get into the replacement behavior pathway. So that's a recap of what we've done so far. That shouldn't be too shocking to you guys. Don't worry if you haven't memorized it or anything. That's why we go over it each time. Now what are we going to add to that? Well, sorry, not quite. The other thing we added on last time was keeping track of that whole thing, and in particular measuring it over time and analyzing how it's going, right? Because we said you're not going to know if it's working or not if you don't have some data to go on. So this is just a little sort of example of a rough thing you could do on a bit of paper, setting out your plan for how you're going to measure things. So you've got some difficult behavior there in the top box. How would we measure it? Remember we had some options for that. It could be number of school nights that it happened. Paul, good question about if you get a copy of that flowchart. Yeah, we'll put that in the handout that comes around after each session. That'll be later in the week. So today's webinar, what are we going to add to that? Let me just give you a little briefing on what to expect today. So last session was kind of all about, measuring, keeping track of behavior, making sure we've got all our sort of variables considered. This session we're diving back into the tantrum itself, and this is often what parents really want to know is, what do I do? Are tantrums happening? What do I do? How do I react? What's the best way to respond in those often highly stressful situations? In particular, we're going to be interested in the consequence part of that flowchart that we just looked at. Now I'm bringing out this picture again. You will have seen this before. Basically, I want to make the point again that this is a great place for us to kick off our topic again today, because the idea is we want to be prepared before we get into the situation. Tantrums are stressful when they're happening, don't put yourself under more stress by trying to work out what to do at the time. So tonight I want to do my best to try and set you up so that you know what to do, that you're prepared, and then when you're under pressure, it just kind of happens automatically and you don't get overwhelmed by the situation. All right. Bear in mind, you'll also need some self-calming skills, most likely. It's not as easy as I'm making it sound to just stay calm. There's a real skill in that. I recommend there are things like mindfulness. That if you're familiar with that, it's a great technique. Other stress management stuff. We'll do a little bit of that in session number 7 in a few weeks' time. And you might also be able to find some information on raising children about that. But it's important. Now also, just to emphasize again, we want to plan ahead. Don't wait until the moment to do what you're, to plan or work out what you're going to do. So tonight, you'll probably latch onto what we talk about. I would say what we've already done is more important. The stuff about working out the purpose, keeping track of the behavior, is going to be more important for your long-term effectiveness in managing your child's behavior than what you do, the particulars of your response. You can get away with a basic response provided you've got your done your homework around why the tantrum's happening. All right, you will have heard this before as well, but I want to recap a basic sort of plan you can use. Do it in your head, write it down somewhere. 4 things you got to plan for when the tantrum happens. What behaviors do you want? What behaviors don't you want? Now this second one, I'm going to bring myself back on screen. For this second one, guys, don't just tell me tantrums for that second point. I know that's the obvious answer. The behavior you don't want is a tantrum. Remember before we've talked about we need to be more specific. So what is it about the tantrum that causes you a problem? Is it that they're hitting you? Is it that they're screaming? Is it that they're disrupting their siblings? Is it that they're not participating properly in something that they're supposed to do? Is it that they're not eating their dinner? Work out what the actual problem is and specify that in this little planning step. Here I go again. Then decide on some positive consequences, some negative consequences. All right, so let's launch into what we're going to cover today. The first 4 bits are kind of a checklist of actual steps that we'll go through. So first you want to check the purpose in your mind. Second, you want to try and trigger your replacement behavior. Third, you want to provide a positive consequence. Again, you'll get copies of this stuff, guys. Don't worry if you're not picking it all up as I go through. If the replacement behavior doesn't happen, you want to provide a negative consequence, or at least have that option. And then the last point, we'll just have a bit of discussion. Given that we're at the end of level 2, we've covered some really good core content, and I want to check where you're up to and give you some tips on tweaking it, improving your approach. Hope that suits you guys. Let's kick off with check the purpose. I'll just put that little tab over to the side like we normally do. All right, what can I tell you about checking the purpose? So the basic idea is draw on what we've learned in the past 3 sessions. Particularly session 2 is going to be important to you folks. All that work that you've done behind the scenes is going to hopefully tell you why your child is having the tantrums, what the functional purpose of it is. So you'll want to have an idea of why the tantrum is happening, all right? Hopefully, if we've learned that thoroughly, in the moment, it'll just come to mind. You'll be like, oh yes, I prepared for this, my time to shine. I know why this tantrum is happening, or I've got a theory. It's, seeking attention, or it's avoiding an activity, or it's seeking a sensation, any of those 6 that we went through previously. Only give yourself a little bit of time to do this. You don't want to be spending a few minutes standing there going, I think, are you doing this because of, well, what was the trigger again? No, I forgot. No, you don't have time to do that. You've got sort of maybe 10 seconds to respond after the tantrum or the difficult behavior, maybe 30, but we're not talking minutes here. Luckily with tantrums they tend to go on a while, so you get multiple opportunities to respond. I say luckily, I mean I say that a little bit tongue in cheek. But so you want your response to be fairly quick if possible. It's too late to be working it out in the moment. That train has already left the station, I'm sorry to say, guys. So if the tantrum's happening and you're spending too much time sort of in your head trying to work it out, that's not ideal. You want to do that thinking beforehand and really learn it thoroughly. So try and work, you know, like we've seen our friend Godzilla here before trying to plan his invasion of Japan. We don't know how much thought he really put into that, do we? I don't know how that went. I've never really paid much attention to those movies. But we want to at least do our planning and have a you know, a sort of a catalogue in your mind. If there's multiple purposes going on, just have a catalogue of, right, these are the kinds of tantrums I get in these sort of situations so that they can kind of come to mind when you need them. So be prepared before you launch in if possible. What do you do if you're not prepared? Now there's a good question. Whoops, I'm not sure what the purpose is. What do I do? Don't fret. All you need to do is keep calm and don't overreact. And then just keep them safe and wait it out. Don't overcomplicate things, folks. If you're not sure what the purpose is, not a whole lot of point trying to invent some trick to respond. I would say just keep calm, don't make a huge deal of it, and wait it out. Now, once again, here's our summary of the possible purposes. Hopefully you guys have got some ideas. I know we did that little discussion last time. People had some great ideas. I think most of you had an idea of what the purpose might be for your child. Remember, it's only tentative at this point. It doesn't matter if we change it as we go along, but just have a purpose in mind beforehand. Excuse me. All right, so you just want to check the purpose before you launch into your response. Next, the most important part, we want to prompt a replacement behavior. Remember, positive reinforcement is by far the most effective way of changing a child's behavior. Basically getting them on board with doing something better, much more effective than trying to stop them from doing something. Do you remember how we talked about that? Stop, don't. These don't tend to be effective ways of influencing your child. It's much better to tell them what you want them to do instead. How do we do this? This is a recap, folks. Thinking about what your child could do instead, you need to have this planned ahead of time. Don't try and work it out in the moment. You can always go back to session 2, I think it was, where we decided on replacement behavior and review that. I won't go into it in too much detail here, but these are in rank order. Remember, the best option is something acceptable that will achieve the same purpose. That doesn't seem possible or you can't think of anything, go for number 2 there. Something a child could do that is incompatible with the behavior. So that would be if they're, the example we had was if they're pulling the cat's tail and you don't want them to do that, teach them to pat the cat instead. It's hard to do both of those things at the same time. If they're into biting, get them to sing instead. I don't know. That might be a bit strange, but just anything that's incompatible. And finally, just something generally positive that you can lead them towards and say, we don't want to do that difficult thing. Let's just go do this instead. Now, this is where I want to do a little bit of interaction for tonight. So bear with me. If it's not your cup of tea, just stick around for a couple of minutes anyway. We're going to have a little discussion because I feel like I need to check whether you have a replacement behavior in mind. All right, I'll bring up the previous slide again in a second, but can you do me a favor? Type into chat your current thinking for at least one replacement behavior that you're planning to use. If you haven't thought of one yet, turn your thinking caps on. Here are your options again. So, and remember, see how specific you can be with your description of your replacement behaviour. Remember how we did the telephone test? That would be a wonderful test to apply to your own description of your replacement behaviour. All right, is anyone working on that? Let me see. I can usually see when people are working on it. All right, people are commenting. Let's see. All right, people are making comments. Thank you. Louisa, you had a suggestion about talking skills so they can get what they want in an acceptable manner. That sounds like a very good idea, and that would be a #1 example, I think, on our slide here, because you're trying to help them achieve the purpose in a more acceptable way. That's a great idea. And I do wonder what some of those talking skills might be, because when you're prompting your child, you're going to want to say something like, I don't know, use your words, or tell me what you want, or something like that that's specific. That's a great suggestion. Mel, you had a suggestion about holding hands while crossing the road. That would be a great replacement behavior instead of a whole lot of things, wouldn't it? Like running away, refusing to cross the road, sitting down in the middle of the road and having a tantrum. Tanya, you've got distraction with a positive action, knowing their interest. Great. So you'll need to know ahead of time what particular interest is most likely to be relevant depending on where you are and what you're doing, but that sounds good to me. And Deborah, you've got getting them to kind of take on a more responsible role. Again, I wonder if I can get you to be more specific there. What sort of things would someone do if they're taking on that responsible role? Because when we get to prompting in a second, we want it to be really specific. We don't want anything that can be misinterpreted. I'm just going to make the chat box a bit larger, actually. I should have done that already. Gabriel, okay, you've got a good example about accepting their order within taking turns. That's a good idea. Okay, feel free to keep commenting. I'm going to keep moving, but I'll have a look back if you've got more comments and try and give you some more guidance on refining these replacement behaviours. Because there is a little bit of a skill to it, to getting them just right so that we can give ourselves the best chance of making them happen. All right, so we've had our little discussion. Now remember this slide where we talked about the best ways to give instructions. So we want to use those skills here, and I'll recap them in a second, but I just want to also add a little bit more. So remember how we had, I should have used that slide again actually. Remember our theory of why tantrums happen? It's to do with frustration and feeling overwhelmed. So there's a certain purpose that they're trying to achieve, kind of emotional response, and the child gets overwhelmed. So you can think, if you're really overwhelmed, it becomes harder to think clearly. That's particularly true of kids. And don't make that little adult mistake that we talked about in a previous session. We need to kind of help our child out by not giving them too much to think about. So it's got to be clear, it's got to be simple, it's got to be direct. Okay. Now, also don't turn it into a request. You're not having kind of a negotiation with the child. It seems a bit fussy, this, but I think it does actually make a difference. If you say, Sam, please stop doing that, or Sam, please be gentle, or please hold your brother's hand, something like that, it sounds great, except the please part just gives that hint that this is more of a conversation rather than a John, hold your brother's hand. Just flat and distinct. There's no real thinking to do about it. There's a little bit of thinking because they still have to understand what the words mean. You're kind of trying to act as the thinking part of the brain for them to try and fill in while they're so overwhelmed. Okay? So basically, like I always say, don't rely on talking when it comes to tantrums. Don't do too much talking. Keep the words to a minimum. And of course, you want to use good prompting. Things like eye contact, getting down to your child's level. Use their name first. You want to get their attention. If your child's having a tantrum, you might have noticed their attention is all over the place. They might be rolling their eyes. They might be running around the room looking at all sorts of things. You want to give yourself your best chance of getting their attention. You want to wait for a moment, give them a chance to process what you're saying or direct their attention towards you. You want to provide a positive consequence if you're successful in their response to your prompt. And you only want to give one prompt at a time. That's another little thing to be mindful of. If your child's having a full-on tantrum, there's often a few problems. Like you want them to be gentle, you want them to put down the toy, you want them to wait their turn. Maybe there's a whole lot of things going on. You probably need to choose just one as your prompt. Now, I know some people are still still working on the discussion there, and we've had some more comments. If you're on a mobile, it may not work all that well. I know it's a bit harder to use some of the webinar features. I'm sorry about that, but hopefully I'm still coming through loud and clear. Danielle, you had a suggestion about making a game out of something. Louisa, you had, yeah, talking skills. I want to help you. Right. Okay. Let's move on. I think you guys are on top of that, and let me know if there's any dramas towards the end of the session. We can deal with that in question time. Now, here's an interesting question. What do you do if they don't respond? You've done your darndest to give an effective prompt for good behavior, and the child's like, nah, not having it. How do you respond then? Do you double down and try and even harder to get them to respond? The answer is no. Don't keep trying if they don't respond. This is kind of like a one-time chance for your child to respond. Give them every opportunity within that chance. All right, so make sure it's a clear prompt and they have a reasonable chance to respond. But you don't need to enter into a whole, you know, all right, I need to give some other instruction, or I need to try something else, or I need to speak louder, or I need to add on a threat or something. No, I wouldn't recommend that. It's better to just give them a chance to respond, and if they don't, too bad for them. You'll move on to the next step, which is a consequence. They've missed their chance, okay? So that's important. Remember, you can probably tell by now that that in this approach we need to keep things quite simple. We're letting our actions do the talking more than our words. All right, so that's what we wanted to say for prompt or replacement behavior. Now, if you are successful, you're going to need to provide a positive consequence, or it will help if you do. Let's just check how we do that, and I'll see if there's anything further I can contribute. Yeah. So provide a positive consequence. Put that tab on the side. Remember this image. There's 5 options here that we identified. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on each one. I think this is something that it's great for us to kind of go through maybe in level 3, the next 3 sessions, to try and help you with your particular ideas around positive consequences, because it's kind of intuitive, I think, with the names, but sometimes you can get caught up on the details. Anyway, so the first option we had there was labeled praise. Okay? Labeled praise is an example of a kind of social reinforcement. It's kind of like saying good job. Now, it might sound kind of minor to an adult, I don't know, but to a child it has a lot of significance, particularly if it's coming from an adult or a central kind of carer type person in their life. Even if your child doesn't seem to respond at first, they almost certainly will be affected by labeled praise. Now the labeled part is particularly useful. That's where you name the behavior that you're pleased about while praising your child. So that, remember how we prompted, this is another chance for them to hear what it is that you want that they've now successfully completed. So if your instruction was, use your words, I'm just using that as a simple example, and then they do it, you say, hey, Jim, you used your words, fantastic. So they've heard again that that's the thing that's earned them the praise. You can also use other kinds of positive social consequences like smiling, hugging, giving them a high five. You might even be able to come up with some of your own, but labeled praise, I would say, should be your go-to. Another option is attention, right? Another sort of social reinforcer. Your attention can be very powerful, both for good and evil, folks. No, not evil. Both in a helpful way and an unhelpful way. Just like if a tantrum is done for the purposes of seeking attention, or that seems to be the purpose of it as we've worked out, attention can be used to help the replacement behavior. So we should consider using attention. And what's the best way to do that? Well, keep it simple again. It doesn't have to be over the top. It's not like you're giving them 10 minutes of labeled praise, telling them how wonderful they are and how much you love them and how awesome it is what they've done. Keep it simple. Just do some little activity with them, watch a bit of a show that they like, sit down next to them and watch them color in. That kind of stuff can be really powerful, particularly if you're in a busy family, and hey, who isn't these days? And there's not always a lot of opportunity for that. If you line your attention up with good behavior, gee, it can really make a difference. And it only needs to be short, sorry, only 5 to 10 minutes is plenty. You don't have to, sign over your whole afternoon just because they calmed down from their tantrum or did a good behavior. Now rewards. In simple terms, you probably can guess what this is. It's something your child wants. Could be a toy or an activity, are usually the two main categories that we might think of. Just to build on that, a really powerful way of sort of being practical about using rewards is to establish what we call a token economy. Don't know if you've heard of that. I'm not going into sort of a financial discussion here, but it's a reward chart that you might have seen is an example of this, okay? All a token economy is that you use little tokens that don't have much value on their own, but they represent something more valuable to your child. So something like star stickers. You might decide that 10 star stickers represents a new little toy or half an hour of iPad time, something that they want. The reason it's so successful is that if you use it a few times, the stickers or whatever token you use come to have real value for your child, right? And it's a much simpler way of trying to provide a positive consequence than, you're trying to think up a positive reward each time. You can have a toy. You can have some more iPad time. It's much better you can just, don't even have to think about it, give a star if they do the right behavior. You could also use things like little toy coins or like those little Woolworths little things that they give out. I probably shouldn't say that, given it's one of those little knickknacks that you sometimes get at non-specific supermarket chains. Anything that you can kind of have a lot of, don't cost much, and you can use to represent good behavior. All right, now next option, food. We've discussed this before. Some of us have some wariness about this, and I think with good reason. Parents are pretty switched on about food these days. Diet, exercise, setting up healthy eating patterns. So good on you for being hesitant. That is not a problem. The idea of using food as a positive consequence is it's particularly effective because it gets a sort of direct physiological response. It bypasses any thinking that the child has to do. Of course, you might be wary of some risks involved with that. What I would add to that is if you're uncomfortable, bear this in mind. You'd probably only use food as a reward in the context of a healthy diet, So I'm not saying suddenly bring in a whole lot of junk food to get your child's behavior to change. If your child occasionally has some sort of junk food anyway, I mean, by junk food I mean sort of lollies or stuff that isn't particularly nutritious that they really like. If they have that anyway, just change when you give it to them. Just make sure only give it to them after a good behavior. So if they normally get one lolly a week, just give it to them after a particularly good behavior. The same dietary consequence. Now, still you might have concerns, valid. It's also going to make more sense to those parents who have real difficulty changing their child's behavior. It's really out of control, or their child has a disability that makes it hard for them to learn the new behavior and what's expected of them. So if you have a child with intellectual disability, that might be a valid consideration for you, just as an example. All right, let's move on from that. Getting out of doing something else. I don't want to say too much about this one. I think you got the idea of this last time. If you have a range of expectations of your child, they're not all that keen on some of it, you might be able to use some sort of reward system that says, hey, you've done such a great job of this important thing, why don't we do something else instead of that chore you don't want to do? Again, don't shoot yourself in the foot by stopping a really good behavior that you actually need. But again, I think it's a consideration for those particularly tricky situations where it's hard to shift their behavior. All right, so hopefully you've got some ideas about positive consequences. I don't think any of that's rocket science. Let me know if you're confused about it. I can see some good comments, yes, about using a timer from Deborah. Louisa about a sticker board, yeah, that's a good idea. So I think people sound like you're on board, but of course do let me know if this is confusing for you. We'll have time to go over it at the end. Providing a negative consequence. Now this is the meaty part, the tricky bit. I don't think it needs to be tricky. We're going to keep it simple. I'm going to break it down for you. And let's launch into that now. I just need to... All right, let's move on. There's the tab on the side. How are we going to provide a negative consequence? So here is how it works. There's really sort of 4 elements to it. You'll notice I've got a 5th one off to the side there, physical punishment. That's just so that I can put a cross over it, okay? I'm not saying that's a good option, and I'll tell you why in a second. So firstly, you can physically intervene. This is mainly for safety, and I'll tell you how to do that. Second, don't use physical punishment. I'll tell you why. Make sure you set up expectations beforehand so that your child knows what the consequences are going to be. And then choose either taking away some sort of privilege or using timeout. So let's go through these options now. So physically intervene. There's a certain thing I mean by physically intervene. Basically I mean for their own safety and for some sort of basic compliance. Now you might be worried about, is it okay to kind of, you know, hold them when they're upset? Is that going to make them cause some sort of issues for them? These kind of concerns come up. The answer is no if you're careful about how you do it and you're sensible and you're calm. Obviously, if you're a professional, that's a separate issue and you need to be aware of the rules for your profession about touching children, you know, intervening physically. So that's trickier and I can't explain that to you here. If you're their parent, it is appropriate and safe to intervene physically. So what I mean by that is, as you can see in the picture, it's okay to take their hand and sort of firmly lead them where they need to go. Or if you're going to use timeout, and I'll tell you how to do that, it is okay to pick them up and go and put them in timeout. If they're hitting out violently, it's okay to hold their fists. What I wouldn't do is sort of pin them down or try and overly restrict them. They're going to want to wriggle probably. It's not a good idea to try and hold them completely still. That's not generally a recommended approach. So it's sort of a minimal amount of physical intervention to keep them safe and to get them to do the basics of what you need them to do, like come over here or sit over here, something like that. But keep it to a minimum. And also while you're doing this, beware your own mood. If you're starting to get really worked up and kind of you can feel your teeth clenching and you're concerned about your own reactions, I would suggest don't physically intervene unless you absolutely have to, or see if you can get someone else to help you, because there is a little bit of a risk that usually adults are much more powerful than children, and you don't want to kind of put them in a situation where you accidentally do something more rough than you intended to. All right, now what do I want to say about physical punishment? We're not going to have a discussion about physical punishment here. I just want to give you some information. If you're not sure about what I'm saying or it's concerning for you in some way, this is one way you really should go and get some professional advice on yourself. For yourself. Because I'm just not going to be able to do that kind of intensive support that it would take to help you understand or manage that kind of issue in your family. So there is some great information on Raising Children Network, which I'll just type the link into chat now, around physical punishment. Often it's called smacking or spanking, which explains it there and gives you some further references and stuff. There's two main reasons that two main points that the scientific literature makes about physical punishment that I think are most important for you. One is it doesn't work. That's a pretty good reason not to do it in the long term. So it often does work in the short term because it kind of scares the child into complying. Problem is then you're using kind of an emotional response to deal with an emotional overwhelmed situation. I'm sure you can imagine how that's not going to go all that well in the long term. Okay? And also it just has been found, it doesn't generally tend to be effective. It'll stop the behavior possibly then and there, but the behavior will return, and often with a vengeance later. Now, Karen, you've got a comment about timeout not being an option for you as in your professional capacity. That is often the case, and I understand that you're restricted in that sense. And we might have we'll touch on that later. The second reason not to do physical punishment is there's a high risk of harm. Often parents don't realize that. There's high risk of both psychological harm and physical harm, where parents don't always realize exactly the impact of physical punishment. The risk is so high that it's just there's really no good case for using it. So that's really all I wanted to say about physical punishment. It's not part of any effective approach to behavior management that's ever been established, and no psychologist is going to endorse that. Now, what about valid negative consequences? A really good one is take away privileges. Two ways you can do this. A token economy can work okay here, like you can do the strikes thing, but try and make it visual. And beware empty threats. So when I tell you this, bear that in mind. You can't threaten to take away privileges and then not do it. So the first way of taking away privilege is to take away your attention. Treat your attention as a privilege. Your child does need some of your attention deprived, but they don't need it all the time. And if they're doing the wrong thing, you are perfectly within your rights, and it is perfectly appropriate to remove your attention. In other words, to ignore them on purpose. This is a technique called planned ignoring. It can be quite effective, and you might often have seen parents do it. If you've seen a child having a huge tantrum in a shopping centre and the parent almost acts like it's not happening, that might be an example of planned ignoring. That's assuming that the parent has planned to do that, and it's not that they just couldn't be bothered. So planned ignoring is you're intentionally choosing that as your response, and obviously it's going to be effective, particularly if your child's doing it to gain attention, if that's your identified purpose, but also for other ones too. Or you can take away an activity. Again, I've just got an iPad there because that's a good example. Be wary of taking away activities that you kind of want your child to do. Like if your child really likes drawing and the privilege that you take away is access to drawing materials, it's kind of like a double whammy. Then you've got this bad behavior and they're not doing this wholesome activity later. So try and make it something that you're not too fussed about whether they do it or not. So that's my suggestions for taking away privileges. Only do something that you're prepared to follow through with. Don't say, all right, if you have a tantrum, the consequence is no TV for a week. Gee, you'd better stick to it, and that might be a little bit over the top. Maybe you lose half an hour of TV. All right, let's get on to timeout because it'll take a little bit of time to explain this, and then we'll wrap up with time for questions. All right, so there's often a little bit of confusion about timeout, and you might have heard different opinions on it. Some people think it's great, some people don't like it. That can get confusing, even amongst professionals. There's a level of disagreement there. I think the reason people get confused about timeout is that we're actually talking about different things. So what I'm going to present to you tonight is the right way to do timeout, which is very effective when done properly. Timeout is not effective when not done properly and arguably has the potential to be harmful if it's not done properly. If you do it the way I tell you tonight, it will work very effectively. And it's not complicated, okay? So let's get into it. So let's first of all cover what timeout is. Here's the situation. This is the room, your house, your life. This is the best way I could think of to represent it. Explain beforehand what's going to happen to your child. So here's, looks like a mother and a child sitting down. Speech bubble means she's explaining, look, if you hit, you will go in timeout. That means you'll go and sit over there and you won't be able to play for 4 minutes. I'll tell you about timing in a second. So you explain what's going to happen. And maybe it's like, Johnny, if you throw the ball in the house, you'll have to go in timeout. And of course, Johnny goes and throws the ball in the house, as kids do. You wouldn't need to set up this if it wasn't a high likelihood of this difficult behavior happening. So you come along and say, all right, you label what they've done, give them a prompt to stop, but explain you need to go in timeout. Again, we're not doing much talking here. Keep it very simple. Then you take them and you put them in a particular part of the room that is generally removed from a whole lot, all the kind of exciting, interesting stuff that they have. Now, sometimes there's a bit of an issue that sometimes people use the child's bedroom as a timeout area. It's not the end of the world if you need to do that. It's also not ideal. All you want is a calm, quiet sort of area that's not very interesting. If it's their bedroom, the problems are they probably have a lot of interesting stuff in there. And two, there's a risk that they might kind of form a negative association with their room and be like, nah, I feel like I don't want to be in here. So just find a general, sitting on the bottom of the steps or in a quiet corner of the lounge room where there's nothing to do is a good option. Then you go and set a timer and you set it, a good indicator, it's just a few minutes. We often suggest a minute per year of their age. If they carry on and they keep doing the negative behavior, like they're coming out of timeout, they're hitting, they're not sitting still, something like that, you start the timer again. So that's however many minutes you decide needs to be of doing timeout properly. So often the first time you do timeout or the first few times, it can go on for a long time. Then you go back and say, all right, you can come out of timeout. There's no big deal again here. It's not like, thank you so much. It's not like rubbing it in like, you see you shouldn't have done that, or I hope you thought about what you've done. None of that's necessary. Then maybe they go back and they do it again. So you put them back in timeout. You repeat as many times as you need to. Set the timer again, go back and let them out. And that's it. So it's quite simple. You'll notice I've said there's not a whole lot that you have to do in terms of talking there. So what are the benefits of timeout? Research has showed that where parents use timeout, it actually teaches emotion regulation. So kids are learning to regulate their own emotions. It's basically saying to them, hey, as a parent, I'm observing that you're out of control. We need to go and calm down. And then they sit down and they're breathing and they're just gradually calming down on their own. It removes implicit rewards. So if your child's doing something problematic like hitting, screaming, tantruming that's causing a problem, and they are allowed to stay in an environment that they enjoy, that might actually be an implicit reward for them. So they're getting something that they want while tantruming. And finally, it's aversive but safe. So kids often don't really like going in timeout. They wouldn't say, please, can I go in timeout? But it's safe. It's not traumatic for them. It's not causing any risk to their safety or anything like that. What timeout isn't, I'll just go over this quickly. It's not shaming the child. So you don't put them in timeout and say, you're so naughty, I'm so disappointed in you, I'm so disgusted in you. You don't make them face the wall. It's just calm. It's just, all right, you did the bad behavior. We'll just go in timeout for a bit. It's not about getting revenge. I think that's a bit dramatic, but it's not about they've done something to upset you, so you're going to get them back by putting them in timeout. That's important. It's just calm. It's just natural. Oh well, if you're not coping well in this situation, we're going to put you somewhere quiet, and you're going to need to calm down. And it's not about yelling or lecturing. I think I've made that point already, haven't I? I'm always saying keep the talking simple. You don't need to tell them, think about what you've done. You don't need to tell them, I expect you to say sorry. Just let your actions do the talking. Keep it simple. All right, so we've gone through timeout there. We've got some good questions I can see, so let's get on to question time, I think. For end of level 2 discussion, I just had some tips that might help you. We've already discussed this one, that we're looking for improvement, not perfection. So don't worry if you don't see any improvement at first. And in fact, I think we had a question kind of along these lines. The behavior might get worse when you start implementing some of these consequences. That might be that they don't like it and they're protesting, or they're kind of, particularly in the case of tantrums, it's not uncommon for them to kind of escalate and to be like, this isn't working. They're not consciously thinking this, but they're thinking that under the surface says, this isn't working, I better turn up the volume to try and get a reaction. So don't be surprised if things get worse before they get better. That is normal, and I want to prepare you for that. If you're struggling, you might need to work on the timing of things. Then your child's learning here that the bad behavior goes together with a certain consequence, just like this dog was popping a bubble. And consistency is also important. All right, I won't go on about that to you guys. So you're in charge. You've learned a lot now, and you can apply your own thinking. That's all I wanted to say there. So let's go on to Derek, our facilitator, who I forgot to introduce again. I think shared the link earlier, the feedback survey. Don't go just yet because we're going to have a good discussion. I can see there are lots of great questions. If you do have to go, see if you get time to fill out our feedback survey, gee, it's hard to talk, through the link provided, or when I end the session, that should open for you automatically if you're on a computer. Now, so that's just a note on the feedback survey. So we won't bother with that recap. Next session, by the way, number 5, teaching skills for better behavior. There was an error on Raising Children, the website. It said 8:30, I believe. It's the same time, same place next week, all right? You'll get the link in your email, 7:30 p.m. next Tuesday. All right, let's go on to questions, because there are some good ones here. I'll just mute myself for a sec while I'm looking at these. I'm still here, folks. All right, I'm just going to launch straight into these, so bear with me if I have to pause to think at some point. Olivia had a question of, does the positive consequence have to be related to the behavior, or can it be totally unrelated? The example was getting in the car, so do we want a positive consequence that is car connected? The answer is no, it doesn't have to be related at all. The idea is a positive will in itself be motivating. There might be some small help from the fact that the child's anticipating the positive consequence when they see the car, if it's a car-related one. That may work in your favor in terms of prompting preferred behavior, but it doesn't have to be specific to the situation. It could be a token that's got nothing to do with the situation, for example. Mel's question, can you call it thinking time or calming time? Absolutely. I'm calling it timeout. You can call it whatever you want. I would suggest call it something neutral though. I wouldn't call it something really negative. Sometimes people say things like naughty corner or the naughty spot or your naughty chair or your bad boy area. I don't think that's a good idea because that then is again sort of an emotional response to an emotional problem. You want to keep it very neutral. It's almost like you don't, no big skin off your nose. They just need to go in time out to calm down. So I would suggest thinking time, calming time, perfect. Mel, I'm so glad you've asked this question. When showing unacceptable behavior, so kind of, you know how we talked about preparing them beforehand, explaining what's going to happen if you're using timeout. When you're showing them unacceptable behavior, so preparing them for what's going to happen, do you warn them of the negative consequence? Yes, exactly. That's what you should do. So don't worry too much about the positive consequence. The negative consequence is the important one. I'd leave the positive consequence out, say, you know, we're going to the shops now. If you yell at me because you want a treat, then there will be no, you know, you lose half an hour of TV, something like that. So yes, you should explain what the negative consequence is to set it up properly. Flavia, you had an excellent question too. I love these questions tonight. You are making my job so much easier because it's all this stuff I really wanted to go into more detail about, and you have asked the perfect questions. Can't believe how switched on you guys are. So what if the timeout itself triggers a tantrum? Flavia, your daughter often cries and screams when you put her in timeout. That's okay. Like I said, it's not uncommon for things to escalate when you're implementing something like this, particularly if it's while you're doing it. And it would actually be somewhat rare, I think, for a young child in particular not to do some sort of behavioral protest, like crying, kicking, screaming, yelling, hitting, something like that. So that is okay. If there's a lot of it, you might say, I'm not starting the timer until you stop screaming, until you're calming down, something like that. Because yeah, it's not a reason to abandon it if it kicks off a tantrum. Paul, you had a question. If I was part of the Parents Work online course, as in like involved in hosting that? No, I wasn't. I'm familiar with it, but no, I'm not. Is that the Mark Dad's one? I think it was. Yeah, so Deborah, you also had the point about thinking time. I think I've answered that one. What is needed to get him or her to a safe timeout area? So that's a good question for me to follow up on. It's not always easy to put your child in timeout, particularly if you're out and about. So if you're having trouble to getting them to a safe timeout area, firstly consider whether timeout is the best option or if you're better off just doing what you need to do and getting out of there. If it is possible to put them in, you can do timeout in the middle of the shopping centre. I've known people who've done it. You just find a quiet aisle or a quiet corner or something, put the child in timeout and sort of stand there with your back to them while they're calming down. People come past and say, sorry, my kid's just having a tantrum or something. So that is possible. But all you need is sort of a quiet, safe area that's generally removed from anything that's too stimulating or interesting or exciting. To get them there, like I mentioned before, it's okay to physically pick them up or lead them by the hand. If they're struggling and screaming and thrashing about a lot, is okay. Try and do it safely. I don't want you to get hurt either. Hope that helps answer your question, Deborah. Sarah Jane, you had a comment about time in rather than time out. Now that's an interesting point. We're going to come to what I call time in later in the course in session 7. I think of time in as about being kind of like positive attention. So you're building up kind of this kind of base money in the bank sort of idea of positive attention that is important for relationships in general. That's how I talk about time in. You might be referring to it as in kind of like a direct reward almost, like we talked about. You do the replacement behavior that I want, I'll spend some time in with you, we'll get to do something good. That's also perfectly valid, like we discussed. Shaima, you had a question about if practitioners cannot use timeout, what else should we use? That's a good question. I can't really answer that for you here. I think you would need to talk to your supervisor if you don't have a sort of official behavior management approach where you work. So if you're here attending in as out of a professional interest and you're not allowed to use timeout, I would say that's something to talk to a sort of senior practitioner or get some individualized advice. Often in schools they do things like diversion. That's a very common approach. And it is very hard to do timeout if you're managing a group of children often. So there are limitations there. I can't give you too much else, or I'd be kind of overstepping a bit my professional boundaries about what I can reasonably offer you here. Mel, excellent question. What if your partners are not on board with using these techniques? Will they still work? First of all, gee, I hope you can get your partner on board. It makes it so much better, so much easier. You can share the recording of these sessions with them. You can maybe try and get individualized support so they can talk through their concerns about using these techniques. That would be a great approach. So my first approach would be to say, hopefully there's some way to get your partner on board, but honestly, I know that's not always possible. They will work to some extent, but you know how I kind of rushed through this slide on consistency. If they're sometimes getting the consequence, sometimes not, sometimes getting prompted for the replacement behavior, sometimes not, it's much less likely to stick. So it is an issue. There's nothing you can do about it. Do your best. Try and kind of interject yourself as much as you can into those situations, but it just makes your job that bit harder. I'll see you all next week.